Hey, Melba.
Hey, Sean, can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Hey, I just here. I'll say hi briefly, but there's other
Mm,
people in the
Right,
background, so
fair
oh,
enough.
yeah. How you doing?
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good.
Ready for the weekend?
Yeah, definitely getting there.
Yeah, and I always look forward to Fridays when I can focus on things that I need to do that I haven't been able to do because there's not a lot of meetings.
You do get kind of a short time on that, though.
Yeah, yeah. Hey,
Yeah, I have.
Jay, go ahead.
No,
Sorry to cut you off, Sean. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. No, it's just yeah, no. There's every other week we have no meeting Fridays, and I seem to have a lot of meetings today. I don't know how that worked out.
I try to block off my Fridays so that I don't have meetings, but I have to let myself not schedule meetings, right? Because sometimes people do want to get on my calendar, and I'm like, okay, okay. So I'm letting people get on my calendar when I probably shouldn't, so I can focus. Hey, Jay, how's it going today?
not too bad. How's it going?
Ready for the weekend. Ready for the weekend.
Yeah.
You know.
I still got a lot of stuff to do. I gotta do a lot of pen to paper stuff today. I only have really Friday now only to
Yeah.
do a lot of the writing. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not a fan of writing, to be honest. It takes me forever and a day. I'm much better at visualizations than than writing.
no,
It takes me forever to write a page.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let me see. Did anybody else? Because I know Gilbert said he could make this. Marcella said she could make this. So oh, there's Alistair. Hey, Alistair. Thanks for joining. So
Right.
we'll give folks a couple more minutes because I do know that there were other people that said that they could join at this time.
Hey Jay, nice to second call this week I've been on with you.
Yeah, we got to keep we have to keep meeting like this. That's what we have to keep meeting like this. These calls are great. Calls are fun.
But Jay, is this and Sean actually, do you do open source as a full-time job, or is this just kind of like a side part of your job?
Well, my whole rhyme or reason is OpenSSF.
Got it. Okay.
That's my whole rhyme or reason. And of course, I have other projects or programs I'm spearheading to internal to Microsoft, but they're all centered around Microsoft's community involvement in open source and centered around our involvement in the OpenSSF.
Nice.
Anything I do other than that is because I love what we do. So.
Got it. How about you, Sean?
Kind of both. In that, my day job is working for Active State and doing whatever they want, but Active State is primary focus is on producing binary builds of open source software. So basically, yeah, we're heavily involved in open source, and everything we do, it revolves around open source.
Got it. Okay. And then Gilbert, thanks for joining. I was asking the folks like how much of their time do they spend on open source versus their day job?
Okay. Yeah. Would you like my answer or?
Yes, yes, of course.
Okay, sure. I wasn't sure. Yeah, so our platform, I'll call it, we up-level or the DevOps orchestration. So we integrate existing investments that a customer has used, either open source or non-open source, so commercial or open source. We ourselves spin up a bunch of open source projects, open source tools like Jenkins, SonarQube, Argo CD, etc. Right? So we ourselves use open source to help customers out there. So we do spend time doing that, and we've learned a lot from using open source and not using open source. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, this is definitely not my full-time job. It just happens to coincide with some of the stuff that I do. And so I'm always curious how people can attend so many meetings. Because I'm like, oh man, all my other meetings are like killing my schedule. So yeah, it just happens to be that I work in supply chain security, right, internally. And I'm like, okay, I should probably be a part of these groups just to see what other people are doing and see how I can contribute what we're doing internally, right?
Yeah, you definitely have to pace yourself. I mean, it is, if you can't attend all of them, and they really are all week long and all day long. So
Yep.
you do have to pace yourself.
Yep.
Yeah, there is definitely I hear you from supply chain security. I used to run product security for a company before this one, and it's like a very love-hate relationship with community or with the like developers and it's really hard to get them to change if you're not with them at the ground.
Yeah.
That's what we've experienced, and then you hear all these like the stuff that's happening in the news as of 2 days ago, right? Or last week, what happened with Uber, and this week what happened with American Airlines, and you continue hearing those things, and you're like, man, why do this keep happening?
Mm-hmm.
I kind of think of myself as a developer even now, but I work with a lot of developers, and I worry about the supply chain security stuff. I have done for quite a while, but most people just don't. It's like they want to see stuff work, and anything to do with this stuff doesn't help them make stuff work. It makes it harder because they have all this other stuff that you're saying they have to think about, and they just want to go and pick up something from NPN or Maven Central and use it. It's a challenge to get people to kind of realize that there's all of these attack vectors that they need to care about.
Yeah,
It's like, why would anyone do that? It's like, well, because they want to hack you. I mean,
right. That's funny. Yeah, we'd love to talk to you though more on that topic. Not today, obviously, but
Yeah. Oh, Marcella joined. Hey, Marcella.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
No worries. We were just chatting away. So I know, Marcella, you had thoughts about today's meeting, and I know we were supposed to sync up last week, and unfortunately I wasn't feeling well. So where do you want to go from here? Because I know last time we talked, we had this whole sticky session, and then I created this, nice condensed picture. And then Jay talked about the new Microsoft framework that came out. And I know that there's this question that you have out there that I've not answered. So where do you want to go with this, Marcella? Because I know you had some thoughts for today.
I think mostly I want to make sure that we align with the Microsoft SSC. Either make sure that we complement that or just even understand how those two fit, because the last thing that I think any of us wants is to duplicate work at this point.
Yep.
So I think if we can just get a better understanding of what the SSC is going to be covering and what the gaps are that SLSA might still be able to fill, I think that would be my sort of goal for today.
All right, so what I do want to do before we dive in, I think that this is a very good topic of discussion, but I do want to take a step back and level set. These are two different documents, and they should remain two different documents.
Okay.
The scope of these are two different. They're two different scopes, and they should remain two different scopes. One's focused on producing builds that encompass open source, and it involves the builds that get produced from the secure supply chain, and the other one involves ingesting open source and third-party binaries towards the build of services and applications throughout the supply chain, right? So I do want to keep there's like the separation of church and state here. We do want to keep those separate, but they should move in parallel, because you can't successfully accomplish one without understanding the other. And you know, on both ends, right? You can't successfully understand the security and the controls and the architecture and the posture that you're taking towards how you're consuming open source unless you thoroughly understand what the end result's going to be and how you're going to reach IA and GA regarding the builds and the packages that are produced. And then you can't successfully build guardrails around or compliance around or artifacts and attestations around how those builds were developed, SBOMs or otherwise, without understanding your ingestion point with respect to the components or the third-party binaries used in order to create those builds. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The reason why I did bring that up, though, is because during the last meeting that you unfortunately weren't part of, there was some of what we talked about was actually ingesting open source software into proprietary enterprise settings. And so that's kind of the touch point that I was seeing.
Oh, you in the last salsa meeting?
No,
No,
this hybrid. This
Oh, in
meeting.
the last hybrid meeting, yeah, I wasn't a part
Yeah.
of it. Right. Okay, yeah, got it. Okay, good. So yeah, excellent then. So this is an excellent topic of discussion to bring in, because this is exactly what the vision is, marching these two documents together, because I think they run hand in hand. So excellent. Good to hook.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is what we came up with based off of how I think a few of the folks on the call, how they do their ingestion of open source software. And so there's two different scenarios. And this is how it runs with the build, whether it be an internal mirror that is being pulled from for the build, or it looks at some sort of database for the record of here's where you should be pulling the open source software from, and then you can go pull it from the actual public repo. So it sounds like your framework very much is part of this diagram that we're trying to create. And the reason why we're trying to create it is because of the attestation that SLSA currently is providing is, how do I say, if somebody says they're SLSA level 4, it's kind of ambiguous. They can say, well, I build SLSA level 4, but well, what about the source, right? Can you truly attest to all the source when you're doing your builds? Sure, your build infrastructure could be SLSA level 4, but that doesn't mean your source, your provenance is. And so that's kind of where this hybrid model started coming about, because we're thinking about obviously separating the two, having build SLSA level certification separate from source. And if you can do both, great. But if you can't, what does it mean to do source attestation, especially when it comes to a hybrid environment? And so I think that's how this conversation started. And last time we met, it ended up in this diagram.
You know what? I'm asking, so this diagram is great. There is one out there right now that does this from end to end. John Meadows created it for City. I'm asking him right now if he has a scrubbed version of it, because I think it's outstanding. And I think it speaks to both ends of the scale. It coincides with this one. That can help fill gaps on this. So, and the reason why I'm saying that is because so John Meadows is he's the working group chair for the end users working group.
Oh, I see.
And the OpenSSF. So we don't have to recreate the wheel here. We can improve upon the wheel that's being we have to recreate it, we can improve upon it, right? He's this diagram he's created goes from ingestion all the way to availability. I mean, it's a complete diagram, and he's looking at this stuff in such a way where he's like, dude, this fits right in right here. This fits right in over there. How do we build and work in the middle? He's having the same questions that we're asking right now. Same exact questions he has. And he's and such that we just had a one-on-one with him. Adrian and I had a one-on-one with him right now to talk about how what he's doing in city mirrors what we're talking about in the SSC. And of course, on the other end, on the build end, what he's doing there has relevancy and mirrors what we're talking about in salsa. So the use case is here. I just asked him for a copy of that I could bring in this meeting. If he responds to me right away, I'll show a scrubbed version of it, of course.
Yeah.
But I'll bring it here. But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we can talk about the gaps. Gaps between one side and the other.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of the main goal that I had for today, was to, yeah, bridge those gaps really.
Okay.
So
I'm trying
Go
to
ahead.
think. So it sounds like then Jay, you're waiting for John to reach back out, because I would be curious to see does he have other scenarios, or how many scenarios does he have in terms of how this could be accomplished? Is it one? Is it two? Is it 4 or 5? I'm
Yeah,
curious as to what he has.
yeah, as soon as he reaches back out, I just messaged him just now.
Okay.
I know he had another meeting. And I just spoke to him maybe like 20 minutes ago. So I know he was jumping to another meeting. He reaches back out, I'll be able to pop this in. But he had a few use cases.
Okay.
Yeah, he had a few use cases, and it looks so good, and that's the reason why I'm even bringing it up, because when I looked at it, I said, "Oh man, this is amazing. Somebody's already
Awesome.
did this work."
Yep. Yeah, it would be good to see how we can incorporate it into the salsa spec in some way. Not in terms of, saying this is what we must do, but as an example, right? To say
Right.
this is how you could achieve, salsa level 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So then, Marcella, because of this, do we want to hold on these questions that you had, because ultimately they stemmed from
right.
the separation of attestation, but you first have to understand, well, how does the source work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
So-
that's part of why the specification working group is kind of backing off on source at the moment, because that's a much harder question than it is. We've focused a lot more on build right now, and the
Mhm.
source stuff has not been as well fleshed out.
Yep.
I think, yeah, that's also 1.0. We're not going to have much for source.
Well, I think that ties back into what we were saying before about scope, and making sure that that we don't, in an effort to try to cover down on all ends, we begin to do a little scope creep.
Can,
Um,
oh, I'm sorry, Jay.
go ahead, Gilbert.
No, I was just gonna comment on, my apologies. Finish your thought, Jay.
I was going to say we begin to scope creep, where we got other things that we're doing that could fill those gaps, right? That have their own scope, and that way we can keep things streamlined on one side or the other, and it takes less thought or less, it takes less muscle to just go with the flow of what we're currently doing, letting the other one come in and tack on, or bolt on, where there's separation, you can keep them separated, but then kind of bridge those two thoughts together, so that you maintain the scope of each respective one, but there's bridges to close those gaps.
Jay, what's your GitHub handle before Gilbert starts? Do you have one?
Oh, my
Okay.
GitHub handle is CAMALEON. I think it's 2016. I can't remember.
Okay, just let me know.
2016. Let me see.
Oh,
It's
2 zeros. I
2016.
thought you meant like 2 zeros.
Yeah, no. Hold on a
Yeah.
second. I can't.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Go ahead. Okay, go ahead, Gilbert.
I was just gonna point out some use cases on the build scenario, right?
Sure.
That was it. So a couple of use cases that we've seen is obviously securing the build machine, right? No one can inject code at the time of build, right? That would be one. Number two, a lot of the use cases we see is the build machine itself, like how secure is that from I'll call it code as image or image as code. That's number two. And then number three, yeah, definitely challenging or recording all of the build metadata, right? Well, how do we record that? And then number four would be what is in the build, like what kind of, I'll call it a blueprint, if you will, of what the build looks like at every runtime or every time it's ran in a pipeline. So the run count, what changes in the run count happen? So those are kind of four things that we see. Number five, I guess, would be like, do we challenge the person that is actually building the artifact? When can we challenge that author? Even though we have it, can we still challenge them as a SLSA level 4 capability? Because the problem in open source is that we don't have control over the source. Even today, GitHub, GitLab, etc., they have a lot of controls that they need to put into their systems to be able to have that, I'll call it governing hard and governing soft. And we don't control those capabilities. We can only report the capabilities. So that's kind of some of the stuff we've seen.
So are you talking, so you said use cases on build, but you're purely talking about not the software and the protection or the integrity of that software, more on the build system and what it's doing. Is that
Yeah.
accurate?
Yeah, because
Okay.
I think what Jay mentioned is separating church and state, right? We
So,
have to,
Yeah.
Gilbert, what you might be talking about is directly tied to the SSC versus SLSA.
yeah, but also we got to track the history and the metadata, right, of who touches those artifacts, like component ownership and provenance verified. I built a diagram for us. Can I share it? I don't know if it'll
Oh,
be
sure, yeah.
completely
Yeah.
there of what you want.
Stop.
And I haven't incorporated the stuff that you built or that we built on the salsa stuff last time. I just kind of want to explain that, but I mean, they're definitely agree with sharing here. I don't know if this helps, but this is kind of what I was thinking. So developer checks in code, a new for feature X, right? We don't have kind of governance over GitHub or GitLab or etc. because they require a lot of things from a security point of view. So the authorship and provenance gets recorded to a metadata store. Some metadata, I just call this inception for now, which is if we think about metadata stores, I think of them as connected assets or connected objects, right? From like a Neo4j graph database eventually that has metadata, and we continuously record that metadata, right? And then in my ideal world, I would inceptionally challenge, right? I don't have to say Apsara, but Apsara will challenge the 2FA against the author to verify that that is the correct author. Because if Jay's credentials are compromised, I'm just picking you out, Jay, sorry. Don't mean to target you specifically, but if Jay is saying, hey, is this really Jay, right? As opposed to a bad actor trying to, get some injection of code, right? And then we move on to the build stage. Is the build safe on component X? Okay, I'll pause here. I'd just like to get some feedback.
There's the idea
well,
that
so,
at the point of source code ingestion, you will go back and interrogate the author.
Yeah, yeah, so that's the idea, is that every step we kind of we verify the authorship and provenance of that field. Does that make sense to you guys?
It does. I'm not sure. I think you might get a bit of pushback against that again in kind of general open source. You know, I've published my thing and I'm done with it. It's kind of the way that they want to do it. They don't want to kind of be fielding 2FA queries every time somebody ingests their source code.
Got it.
Yeah, I'm not terribly sure. It's their well, in a perfect world, you'd like to think that everyone has a moral compass, or everyone has an ethical responsibility, but I think we're talking about ethics versus you know, it's not their responsibility to make sure you secure your environment, right? You can go back and challenge them, but I mean, they're not trying to hear that. They publish, it's out there. If you decide to ingest it in your organization, you need to do the proper scans and check for provenance and check for licensing and everything else. You got to do that. You got to make sure that that's covered down yourself. I mean, that's,
Yeah, I mean, I think the best you can do at that point is to verify that whichever repository you are drawing from had controls in place at the time that the source code was published. That would
and then
ensure what you
yeah.
need.
And then there, you're just making sure that if you're mirroring repositories, you're mirroring repositories that are reputable and everything else. And of course, that's just based on trust at that point, right? What your trust model is.
I think this is feels like a case where if you don't trust the open source project X to have validated that the source being contributed to it came from a trusted developer, then you probably shouldn't be using that piece of open source. And I definitely agree that if you come back 6 months later and try to interrogate somebody who did a commit as to whether or not they are who they really are, I don't think you're going to be able to do that. I don't think you're going to be successful in that. And you know, that's because like there's privacy issues potentially with that. But I've seen cases, you know, when Log4j happened, right, there was a whole bunch of people who were basically sending email to random open source projects saying, I need you to confirm by the end of day today that you do not include Log4j in your open source project because of my corporate compliance requirements. And everywhere that happened, I saw a backlash against it.
Yeah, but that's not, I mean, that's not a scalable solution, right? In my opinion, just because everybody has to go back manually, look for the Log4j, and we did see that, right? There's no way of tying back open source or pipelines or anything to how did this open source, like, you know, Log4j thing happen. Like, I want to say that there's probably companies still out there manually looking for Log4j. I'm deviating here, but I just kind of wanted to, I put this on paper a week ago and I wanted to just share it. If this is the wrong direction, please stop me. I can hand it back to you, Melba.
No, I mean, I think there's something in it, in that you do want to ensure that what you really want to ensure is that when the author published their code, that they authenticated to whichever repository you're drawing from in a way that's compliant with your policy. When they did that, you've then got to make sure that, you know, obviously all the other parts of ingestion is like, okay, so you've got to check that the checksum that he or they actually uploaded with matches the thing that you downloaded, and all of those all of those things that source of provenance is supposed to give you. But yeah, I think one of the things that you have to be very careful of is you can't impose standards on open source users or open source authors. You can encourage them to comply, but you can't impose it on them. I think everything that's every time anyone's tried that, there's been a backlash. I mean, even just getting 2FA into, you know, PyPy publishing for those popular packages has been a struggle. So I think, you know, trying to impose things on people just because you know, I characterized it the other day. It's like, hey, us important guys need you to comply to our policies because otherwise we can't use your stuff and we're dependent on it. Yeah, I think your typical open source author is going to go, ha, good luck with that.
Right, but I think in terms of if you're a maintainer of an open source project, I think being able to that there are useful things as a maintainer of being able to, do I trust this commit? It may be I care about who provided it, maybe I don't. It's whether or not the content of the commit is trusting. So I think I kind of feel like there is something here. There are some best practices around this area, but I think Jay mentioned about trust, right? If I'm going to consume an open source project, I don't trust them to have done a good job on the source contribution, then should you be using that open source project? And I think coming back, a long time, trying to build something so somebody can come back a long time later, and with something that might be looks a bit like a centralized model, I think is probably not going to be very successful. I think it probably needs something that can cope with being more distributed. So if an open source project says, yeah, I want all my contributors to sign their Git commits, they get a gold star, and people who just require you to have two-factor authentication on GitHub or GitLab, you get silver star. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a case of
Yeah.
incentivization there over kind of coercion.
Well, when you talk about that too, right? I mean, we're going back, and this was kind of coined a couple of months ago by my colleague. Well, first time I heard it was from one of my colleagues here at Microsoft, Ava Black. They said trust the process, not the person, right? So wherever you're pulling the component from, whatever their processes are around how commits or pull requests, issues, or commits, or whatever their processes are by which a component gets into the repo, and then whatever processes are followed by how you pull that component built into your environment. Trust that process if that process is good. You don't necessarily, if you trust the process is sound, then regardless of what the author did or didn't do, that becomes a moot point, right? I mean, because the process suggests that you have checks and balances at respective stages in your ingestion process.
Wait, so I don't want to necessarily challenge that statement, but I kind of do at the same time. I know that there's processes, but bad actors still manage to get into that process and follow the process or add bad code to that process. So I just feel like instead of trusting the process, I verify the process, right? And verifying the process is by doing the challenging of, let's just ignore this 2FA for a moment. But what if I had, every time I see this user, I had a database on the side that had a unique ID for that user, separate from their corporate or their GitHub login. And I challenge and I say, hey, this user looks different. Something's different about this user, like almost an anomaly of that. I don't know. I'm still struggling, Jay, to be honest. So I'm not trying to challenge you, but.
Oh, no, I'm with it. I mean, you validate as well, right? You can validate
Right.
the process as well, right? So you verify that there's a problem. You verify that they have a process, but you validate the process against what your own security policies and posture is in your own organization, right? So you have what your own security constraints are. You have what your own security appetite is, and then you weigh that against what the process is from the repo, whatever it is that you're pulling, your repo that you should be mirroring in your organization. First of all, you should be mirroring within your organization something reputable, but you can only verify its reputation based on what you verify and validate against your own security posture, right? I mean, if you did that, then you're 3/4 of the way there. Then of course, if you ingest it, you're taking on that risk, right? But then that's where your scanning comes in, and all of your internal processes come in, by which you safeguard your internal environment after you've decided that you've mirrored the right repository and you're ingesting.
So
those
yeah, you're
protocols.
100% right. I think the idea that I was trying to communicate here, guys, is let's collect the data information and then eventually come into here and set a policy where you set some sort of levels of your own security posture. And then you verify against those levels without really creating a friction, if you will, with the developer or with the end user, I'll call it, right? And then until you start getting to like level 4, unfortunately you're gonna have to create friction with that to really validate the authenticity. I mean, I am completely stuck on that area, but I agree with Jay. Like, we should not scope creep, right? We should definitely find that scope. So
I mean,
Marcelo, my
I
bad.
mean, I would be worried about what if you have if you have a separate system which holds things. I think you've got a whole bunch of security related second attack threats against that data store. If for example it's going to store something that allows you to kind of go back and be certain that a commit was done by a certain person, it's going to be holding identity data, which would be a privacy issue. It's another place that somebody can potentially attack if they want to do bad things. So it just feels like I don't know. Maybe I just don't. I'm not worried enough about the problem that you're worried about. So I look at it and think it seems, it doesn't seem like it provides value commensurate with the thing. And maybe that's just this is not a thing that worries me. I mean, maybe this is a problem with developers and a lot of this stuff is that they have a different perception of what's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think if that store is, I mean, it's important for you to be able to map identities to trust levels. If you've got policies that say, I will not ingest for this particular purpose, I won't ingest anything from somebody who I don't trust to this level. So I think internally it's useful for you to have something that says, okay, given these external identities or internal identities, I trust them to a particular level. And I expect that having, yes, that's a useful target for security thing, but I think it's actually an important thing to have at a policy level as well, because otherwise you don't really have that insight into variable levels of trust of where things have come from. I think you do have to delegate trust to a certain extent, because this is really multi-organization flow. And so at some point you're going to have to say, yeah, I think GitHub can handle usernames and passwords. Yeah, I think GitHub can handle 2FA. You don't want to be saying to everyone that you ever ingest anything from, you have to do a full audit on their stack in order to determine your level of trust in them. You're going to have to take some things at face value, and you're going to have to trust some organizations. And that level of trust is based more on reputation and your interactions with them than it is necessarily any particular deep dive you've done into their stack.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to jump in here for a moment, because I mean, when you said, and I definitely want to give Melba a chance to speak up as well. She's been holding her hand up for quite a while. So in terms of sort of a metadata store, right? I mean, I think SigStore is moving a little bit towards that sort of accepting more than just container signatures, right? And they do provide sort of an auditable data structure that underlies that data store. So it might not address all of the issues, but it is a potential option to just collect metadata that you can then query repeatedly, which I think is what it is that you would like as well, more or less. But yeah, anyway, please, Melba, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm pretty patient with the hand raising. Maybe not internally, but externally I can be patient. So two things. One is I see this as a use case internally, right? Not necessarily pulling external open source projects, but if you had an internal mirror and you wanted to verify that it is coming from the appropriate place, and it's not just a dupe, that could be implemented. There's no privacy issues, right? Because it's more of a company trying to ensure that whatever is pulled is actually being pulled from the right place, and it wasn't tampered with during transmission, or even maybe it's a duplicate URL or IP or something like that, right? So I could see an internal use case for it. The second question, or the second statement I had, which is more of a question, is you mentioned something around validating signatures or something of the sort. That was a while ago, so I can't remember the exact phrase that you or the correct words that you made. But are you thinking more of a, policy as code, where you say, okay, if this open source repo has this, this, and this, and this, then yay, we're good. If it doesn't, let's flag it because we need to do a review. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, and that's what I meant, but I mean, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's what I was thinking in my head. You probably said it more elegantly than I did. But that's exactly what I was thinking, because what we see a lot in the industry is we see security doing a lot of what they call, technical security requirements, right? And those technical security requirements are more on the, I'll call it waterfall enterprise companies. The open source community, they tend to run really fast and more agile, right? And so having the system where we don't need to, again, create friction, but if we can validate in some way that these are kind of the standards, and then get validation, oh, hey, this is new, we see this as a new thing, then let's just have a conversation, right? And then
Conversation internally.
Yeah, about that open source, the new open source
Package. Yeah. And that sounds like that internal vetting. I don't see anything wrong with that, right? Because we're trying to do that, where we say, okay, why are you trying to use this package, right? This is a new package. No one is using it. What's so special about this? Why can't you use this, right? So I don't see anything wrong with that if it's internal vetting. I think, like folks on the call said, like if you're trying to do this externally, that's a different story. But policy as code to verify that community, that package is sound before you can actually use it. I think that's perfectly fine.
So to bring this back to SLSA, because especially if we really try to separate what counts as ingestion and what counts as production, really, can we start to formulate requirements for assigning SLSA provenance levels to code that is put out in a repository? Because I think that's really sort of one of the goals of this particular subgroup of specification, right?
That is the goal.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to find source management requirements. I was looking at your comments from earlier. Source management requirements from the OSS consumer end. We would capture certain properties of the process of consuming the open source in the final SLSA build provenance. Here, let me put this. This was in the Slack channel that you put it, Marcella. Because this was from that specification call like 2 weeks ago, right? We had a couple of outcomes from that meeting or questions from Mark, right? And that goes
Yeah.
back to, I think, what you were just asking, right? Like, how do you address these 3 questions, which I am trying to type here?
Yeah, so I mean, taking into account what Jay was saying earlier about separating consuming versus producing, I think if the SSC is focused on sort of communicating information about or requirements about consuming software, can we still, from a SLSA perspective, generate a list of requirements for producing or putting out open source software, essentially producing these open source software dependencies, right? Right. What does it mean to be a SLSA level 2 open source repo? Is really what I'm asking. Can we come up with something like that? Which is different and separate from what does it mean to consume open source software?
That's fair. That's fair.
So, sorry, I'm not as familiar with SLSA as probably everyone else on the call, but when I had what I had reviewed of it, it felt like it was more about the build output, or rather than the repository. So when you say repository, do you mean like the source repository, or do you mean the artifact repository, like Maven Central, NPM, whatever your language is, distribution mechanism is?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and a really important distinction to draw as well is that I think, so to give you some context, SLSA does mostly focus on build. And so, but there were initially in the 0.1, 0.2 versions of the specification, there were a couple of source requirements as well. And so as part of developing the 1.0 version of the specification, there was a decision in the specification working group to sort of take out the source requirements from the 1.0 because those seem orthogonal to the build requirements.
Yeah.
At the same time, we do think it's important to formulate sort of source repository and also artifact repository requirements at some point. Yes. And so I think this is what this group right now is sort of trying to figure out is what are some of these source requirements. And I'm using source very loosely right now.
Yeah, I think ultimately what SLSA wants to provide you with is a complete chain of custody from the author through to your installed bits. And what we're talking about now is, okay, we're going to refine the SLSA spec to just build. Right. And that means it goes back as far as, the ingestion of the source code through to the bits. And we want to reach back further and find out stuff about the source as well. And I think, one of the things that, that kind of the integration point between SLSA and SSC is, can SLSA provide enough information that SSC can be validated? Can we validate that we met all the requirements of SSC just by looking at the SLSA output?
Right, but I think, so this is perhaps where I'm not quite following, but when we talk about source, in my kind of mind, I think about source code, whereas the OSSC stuff, I think, is about how do you ingest something else, and that something else is something that's been built. So in my, the way I've viewed what Jay has presented, his thing is worrying about what do I do when I'm consuming the output of a build, and SLSA is the attestation of how confident, how much can I trust that thing. So it still doesn't necessarily address the early part, which is how much can you trust the source that leads into the build.
Yeah, And that's the part that kind of has been deferred from the SLSA spec at 1.0, but that's kind of what we're digging into here.
Well, the SSC deals with ingestion as well.
Mhm.
Right, so ingestion is a big part of the SSC as well. And beautiful part is that any gaps identified, that's what we're all here to work on, those gaps. Fill those gaps in.
So Melba or Marcela or anyone, would it help to like go through an example and have a scope? Do we want to focus on the build and then understand the salsa provenance and authenticity of that build, or do we want to focus? I mean, that's what I'm at least understanding, because it's really hard to focus on the source, right? Like Sean mentioned earlier. So how do we want to proceed? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I'm honestly not 100% sure. I'm capturing notes as you all are talking, and I'm like, okay, what what goes first, what goes second, and just trying to wrap my head around what do we need, right? I think that visual helps, right? We know that, hey, the source is coming from over here, but we don't know anything about the source before, right? So that's that trusting, where the source came from, that chain of trust that someone was talking about. And what artifacts do we need throughout the system from a SLSA perspective to trust that source code? And I think that's what you're asking, like, what do we need to do to get to that point? Is that right?
I guess let me
Yeah, I
let
can
me
stop sharing.
yeah, I think it is, but I think what the value is, we want to provide guidance to companies to protect their supply chain. What part of the supply chain are we giving guidance or best practices for them to protect against?
The entire thing.
I know, but the entire thing, I think Sean mentioned earlier, the entire thing is just very difficult, especially if you are not a Google or a Facebook or a big
Yeah.
company that has a bunch of resources, right?
Yep.
How do the smaller guys do it? And how do they, to Jay's point, how do we start the trust? Where does the trust come from? Right. And eventually, I think last time I mentioned something like, kind of like what SSL does today, right? With VeriSign, how they put their stamp of approval on all the websites, and they're kind of the certificate authority of trust, right, for SSL. So how do we create something similar, in my opinion, right? And then how do we, in this team, how do we focus on one part of the scope so we can achieve that and at least have what we call version whatever 3.0, 0.3, right? And then move forward in pieces so we can achieve some, I'll call it, put ourselves with OKRs.
Yeah. I guess there's two parts to your question. I think there actually is an effort to produce salsa badges or something. Am I right about
Yes.
that?
Correct.
So I think that is at least externally one way that, since you mentioned the VeriSign badges, and there's other badging systems too, right? I think that is a parallel effort. The question of root of trust, I think SLSA doesn't want to prescribe who the root of trust is, because it ultimately depends on the verifier. It ultimately depends on each interested party really to decide, do I want to trust GitHub? Do I want to trust this random repo I pulled from GitHub instead? I think SLSA probably should provide the information you need to verify these identities, right? And I think that does come back to what you were mentioning earlier about how do we authenticate the origin of code that we're consuming. So if there was, one of the goals that I see of this subgroup here is to start to develop, I think, a framework for expressing, for, I don't know if it should be developers or if it should be more at the level of GitHub to capture information that allows verifiers to authenticate, right? So yeah, I mean, maybe individual developers shouldn't be in the business of producing this code on their own, but could, I'm just putting that out there, could GitHub, right, produce SLSA compliant metadata for repos that opt into it. That would allow you to verify the authenticity of the authors or whatever it is that yeah, we think is worth verifying at that level and at that stage of the supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, definitely love that concept. I think the lack of, I mean, GitHub, I mean, these bigger source code management repository systems would have to provide an API to produce that metadata, which they can argue also that it could be a privacy thing, right? But I thought about that a little. I mean, I think it's a great suggestion. I don't know that yeah, things are not very black and white. I'll leave it at that.
So I think that you have something with the badges, Marcella, right? Kind of the same thing with what is it called? There's the CII badge, I think, as well, like the best practices badge, right? So potentially if the repository has, not only the SLSA badge, and the SLSA badge requires a CII badge as an example, then the trust level probably goes up. So potentially that is a way of deferring trust, right, to another entity to do the verification on our behalf. And we don't have to go all the way, down that rabbit hole ourselves.
Yeah, that's a good idea to sort of piggyback off of some other existing integrity or compliance frameworks, processes, and maybe even start with that and
Yeah.
say, SLSA source level 3 or whatever is if you have these 3 other compliance, or if you meet these other requirements already.
Okay. I am getting pinged by my manager. So I'm gonna have to drop, but I if you all want to stay on, by all means, feel free. But I do have to drop right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think at this point, I mean, we have like 2 minutes until the hour, so it would probably be good to wrap up. But what do you all think would be good next steps?
I guess I can start. I think Marcela, we could focus on the build requirements, because I feel like we have more control over that step in the process, because it's just one step in the whole supply chain. And then come up with requirements of what we feel, we should look out for at the build step. And then maybe Jay, if you have that, I'm very curious to see that diagram that you mentioned earlier about the use cases.
Yeah, I'll see if I can get that from John. Hopefully, I'll let him scrub it though, because it is something that he's working on internal to his organization. So make sure he scrubs it. But yeah, I can see if I can't get that and bring it here for us to look at it.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know. That'd be my suggestion, Marcela. I don't know what you guys' thoughts are. What do you think, Jay? And how do I say his name? Alasdair?
Sorry, Alistair.
Alasdair. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great suggestion. I mean, I defer to Marcella. Marcella on this one. I think this is an outstanding initiative at this level, just to bridge just to bridge these two together. So how we don't, the questions you're asking are probably questions that everyone has. So let's get them answered.
Yeah. So Jay, do you think it would make sense? I mean, once you get that diagram from Jonathan, you said, do you think it would make sense to present it just among this group? I sort of view this group as like a subgroup of the whole specification, SLSA SIG. But I think the whole specification.
This is a great vetting place as being an outside kind of, an outside the wire type of conversation. Our ideas and thoughts we can bring back to the specification. It might help move things along a bit. I mean, a lot of these meetings get hung up on governance type items and not enough on the actual nuts and bolts of what we're there to do. This conversation can put some nuts and bolts in place that when we go back to that conversation, things are a bit more streamlined conversationally.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Okay, so I guess a few questions. Should we make this a more regular meeting? I don't know, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, something like that. I don't know, third Friday of the month or something along those lines.
I'm with it. Why not?
Okay.
Why not? I mean, like I said, my aspirationally, I want to see an ISO 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah,
that's what I want to see aspirationally, and I want to, and if I'm being a bit my head is being a bit too far into the stars, not even the clouds, too far into the stars. I want to see that in a year, in a year, maybe in a year and some change. I want to see an ISO 1, 2, and 3. So, however, whatever it takes for us to get there, let's have it.
I'm with Jay on this. I'm very aspirational, very, I'll call it, far-fetched, but I want to see it actually sooner than a year. Like I want to see it in the next
Exactly
3 to 6 months, right? Like I want to see version 1 come out, and because we're not gonna be perfect, right, Marcela? And
yeah.
perfection is not made overnight, and we gotta put something out there, and I'm sure we'll get feedback.
There can always be revisions. There can always be revisions. Yep.
I assumed that the year timeline Jay was talking to was to get something through the ISO process and not get the first draft out.
To get something through the ISO process a year or two. And then of course you can have revisions after that, how things improve. But the ISO process itself, I'm not sure how long that is, but I think if we can get to the point where we're having those conversations towards publication, I'll stand.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think so. The timeline, and this is something that I brought up at the specification meeting on Monday. The timeline for SLSA 1.0, I think, is end of this year to have a version just for build out there. And I think even sooner have a draft out by mid-October or something like this. So I think finally we're starting to get things moving, but it's, like you're saying, Jay, like things definitely have been getting stalled over various discussions. So, okay. So we can sort of turn this into given that the roadmap for specification for build requirements is decently tight, actually, maybe it makes sense to have these working meetings more frequently. If people have time for that. Should go back to Melba and also ask if that's something that she can support.
I think the specification meeting is once a week. Maybe we do this every 2 weeks. Maybe do this every 2 weeks. So we've got to build some type of a situation here where we're being mindful of our time.
Absolutely.
Woo! It's just these meetings long. Make it all week long. All week long.
No, totally agree. So I mean, I guess the point I was making more is the specification meetings, the weekly ones, don't feel like working meetings so much as they're a bit higher level, I think.
Well, yeah, absolutely. That's why this is important. I mean, this is important. I think every 2 weeks will work just fine. When we can kind of speed up is once we get a good, unfortunately, Tarantino, as I say, Tarantinoing a lot. You got to work, start at the end to work the middle, right? Usually you start spacing them out more as time goes on. But now, but in this particular instance, you space them out in the beginning so that you have more to talk about.
Yeah.
And then as you build up, as the work builds up, as things become more streamlined, as we start working on these in parallel, then you have more to talk about, and then you can add more meetings on the end. My fear is that doing it every week, we're going to come into these and in an effort to have something to talk about, our deliverables for each person maybe working on a task might be a little shorter just to have something to talk about, rather than providing real impact, which can be covered over a couple of weeks span until we start marching. That 1.0 comes out, the SSC gets built out a little bit more. These things are marching in parallel. We can clearly identify the gaps. Now we have clear direction, clear guides. We need to cover down X, Y, and Z by this date, right? We can put milestones in there. Then we can have weekly meetings, because then it's required just from a project management standpoint to keep the train on the tracks.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Okay. So I'm trying to just organize my thoughts around what we want to accomplish in the next 2 weeks then, for this particular group.
I'll have the diagram from John. I'll bring that up. I think also, this might be a tasking for maybe a couple of people. I know I'll do it. Let's really break open the SSC and the SLSA frameworks as they are right now, and see where there's bridging, where there's parallels, and all that kind of stuff. Then take a look at the diagram. So the diagram needs to come out so that we can both do this, so we can see, so we can overlay both frameworks on top of this diagram. First of all, identify the gaps in the diagram, then overlay the frameworks on top of the diagram, see where the lines begin to blur, right? See where there needs to be a little bit more rigor, a little bit more structure, and then we can go from there. Yeah, that's the long and short. By the time we get to in a couple of weeks, we should have all of that, and then we have more stuff to talk about.
Yeah, sounds good.
Can you share the link to the SSE? I was Googling it, but there's a bunch
Yeah.
of,
Give me one
I just want to make sure I'm
quick.
looking at
And then I got to go too, because I got to eat.
I gotta go to my next meeting. I really enjoy this topic. So
Yeah, absolutely.
and Marcela, we can work off asynchronously too, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Jay, for that link. I'll review this as a homework.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you
So-
guys. I gotta run. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye.